vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Evelyn, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 22nd issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. 7 miles from Sofia, Bulgaria's capital, this former military barracks houses hundreds of migrants. These would-be asylum seekers are pressured to return home, or else languish for 18 months here, packed dozens to a cell. Busmanci, as it's called, is just one in a network of holding centers that the EU has quietly funded as part of a harsh new approach to immigration. The Migrants Detained at the End of the World, by Caitlin Chandler. Caitlin Chandler, who writes frequently about migration, spent 10 months reporting this article, interviewing dozens of detainees and refugees, European officials, and immigration lawyers. The smell of Busmanci's special home for foreigners is indescribable, but if you had to use words, they would be some combination of stale urine, mildew, dried sweat, and rot. 30 people are packed into each cell, which guards lock at 10 p.m. and don't open again until 7 a.m. The rooms do not contain toilets, so at night men urinate out the window. There is no running water, so those with flu or food poisoning vomit into plastic bags. Some men hang sheets around their beds in a gesture toward privacy, but in the corner is a camera with its telltale red eye. Occasionally, a few of the men housed in this former military barracks 7 miles from Bulgaria's capital, Sofia, are brought to a small room where officials from the Bulgarian police and the European Union Border Police, called Frontex, are waiting. There are no lawyers present. The officials tell them they can leave if they sign an agreement to return to their home countries, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. If they don't, they will be locked up for a year and a half. At first, most refuse to sign, but it is hard to hold on to sanity in a Bulgarian cell when you have not committed a crime. So occasionally men sign, and a week or so later they are gone. Those inside rarely hear from them again. Some, though, decide to hold out for the full 18 months, after which most will be released and allowed to remain in Bulgaria. Many hope they'll be able to move on from there. Hesham, a Syrian with honey brown hair and a shy smile who arrived last spring, was among 100 or so men who had chosen to wait. Just a few months earlier, he had been living in a town in southern Germany, learning the language and dreaming of returning to his job as a tailor. But when he arrived for an appointment at the local immigration office in Saxony-Anhalt last February, the police arrested him, detained him for weeks at the Munich airport, then deported him to Sofia. I wanted to file a lawsuit against the prison here, Hesham wrote me on WhatsApp in early June. Do you know anything about this? I began speaking with Hesham last May. We were connected by Astrid Schreiber, an advocate with the Munich Refugee Council, who met him in Munich's detention complex. Soon, I was texting with or speaking to a from Algeria, Iraq, Morocco, Gaza, and Syria, most of whom had been deported from Germany and other EU countries. One man wrote that German police raided his house in the middle of the night. He said that he fled but was chased by dogs and surrendered in a forest. They grabbed me by the feet while my hands were tied, and they dragged me like an animal, he said. Another man wrote, they are threatening to deport me to Iraq. Here I have scabies, and there is no treatment. The situation is very bad, beyond imagination. I want to file a lawsuit against the prison here. Do you know anything about this? No phones with cameras are allowed inside Busmanci, which meant that most of the detainees did not have phones, Those who did shared them, sometimes charging a small fee for access. The detainees told me that they awoke each morning with rosy red bedbug bites across their arms and legs. They tried spraying the dirty mattresses with local chemical products that promised to eradicate insects, but it never worked, or at least not for long. 3 times a day they filed to the cafeteria for colorless meals. Breakfast was white bread. A typical lunch was 1 chicken wing and some cabbage. Dinner was boiled potatoes, bread, and apple. They were offered no education, Bulgarian language classes, or any chance to earn money. Not long after I began texting with Hesham, my messages stopped going through. I also lost touch with 2 other men, an Algerian and an Iraqi, who had been deported from Germany. One detainee told me they had signed the papers to return to their home countries. Hesham, it turned out, was still inside. The prison guards had confiscated his phone, and I could now reach him only through an intermediary. Detention centers like the one where Hesham is held form a kind of demarcation line along the bloc's external borders. There can be as many as 1,060 people locked up in Bulgaria's 2 sites, Busmanci in Sofia and Lyubimets in the south. There are centers on the idyllic Greek islands, Samos, Lesbos, Chios, Leros, and Kos, as well as on the tiny Italian island Lampedusa and the volcanic landmass of Sicily. These are difficult to visit and sealed off from the public. Unless you work there or know someone detained there, they are largely invisible. Most tourists don't even know there is a detention center. Robert Nestler, a German asylum lawyer who frequently visits Kos, told me, "It is at the end of the world." But if detention sites like Busmanci sit at the margins of Europe geographically, they are increasingly central to the European Union's immigration policies. Following the 2015 influx of 1.3 million refugees, mostly Syrians fleeing war, Brussels began to restrict migration, pushing border management and asylum processing to the bloc's farthest edges. Billions of euros were also funneled to neighboring countries to prevent onward migration to the European Union, resulting in detention sites in Libya that are run by militias and mass deportations from Turkey. Now, the most restrictive asylum policies in the bloc's history are unfolding inside its borders. The Pact on Migration and Asylum, finalized by Brussels in 2024 and coming into full effect later this year, expands detention, including for children, and speeds up deportations. Western European countries are now capitalizing on an EU law that requires refugees to apply for asylum in the first country they enter. Those who instead leave for another member country can be sent back to the EU nation where they first arrived. This regulation has long been controversial, says Catherine Woolard, the former director of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, because it places huge responsibility on the countries at the borders. Refugees deported to Bulgaria find themselves trapped in a country that does not want them. Bulgaria has low asylum recognition rates and has lacked an official integration program for the past 13 years. Migrants have died on Bulgarian territory after authorities failed to prioritize their rescues. In December 2024, 3 Egyptian teenage boys froze to death in the snowy southern woods. Those who enter from Turkey are often assaulted by border guards and violently pushed back, as both Frontex and human rights organizations have documented. Nonetheless, Germany, one of the bloc's wealthiest states, is on track to deport 5 times as many people to Bulgaria, its poorest, as it did in 2022. The conditions in Bulgaria's detention sites and abuses along the border have been largely ignored by the European Union. Instead, Bulgaria has become a kind of testing ground for the future of European migration, a heavily patrolled border, fast deportations, and policies that encourage or even coerce refugees to leave. I first entered Busmansi in late August, along with an acquaintance who was visiting a Palestinian refugee from Gaza. As we approached in a taxi, two 4-story concrete blocks loomed behind a high wall topped with barbed wire. It was easy to see how Busmansi served as a stand-in for a West Virginia penitentiary in the 2009 Hollywood slasher Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead. Near the gated entrance hung two signs highlighting €6 million in EU funding. We passed through two gates and entered a concrete courtyard. On the left was a smaller building managed by the State Agency for Refugees, which then housed people with pending asylum claims, including families with children. On the right was the Interior Ministry section, which typically holds those whose asylum claims have been denied. This is where Heshem was kept, at least a dozen men clustered around the windows, waving their hands frantically through the bars. "Hello," they shouted, "how are you?" The Bulgarian government claims that Busmansi has the capacity to hold 400 people, but it depends on how you define capacity. In the summer, a Turkish woman fleeing domestic violence was forced to stay in the male section for almost 3 months, sharing a bedroom and showers with 20 men. Time spent in the outdoor courtyard is restricted to 30 minutes a day, including for children. People with severe mental health conditions are isolated. The center does not have translators, and the Bulgarian staff do not speak Arabic, Pashto, Dari, or French. It falls on the detainees to translate for one another. When an Afghan man was locked in a room alone, the Arabic speakers on his floor struggled to communicate with him. Still, they pleaded with the guards to unlock his door so he could use the bathroom. Some 5 days later, the guards complied. Another man arrived at Busmansi with both legs amputated. The other detainees carried him around. Site visit reports from the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment have extensively documented conditions inside Busmansi and refer to the center as prison-like. "What should I do?" Heshem wrote to me on WhatsApp when we first began chatting. "I can't go to Syria because my house is completely destroyed." It was not the first time Heshem had found himself locked up in Busmansi. Through WhatsApp phone calls, legal documents, and interviews with his sister and advocates, I pieced together how he ended up there 3 times in the space of 2 years. Heshem first entered Bulgaria in September 2023 when he was in his early 20s, crossing the southern land border from Turkey. Conditions for Syrian refugees in Turkey worsened after the country agreed to seal its borders following a deal with the European Union that included €6 billion in aid. A decade earlier, at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, his father, a farmer who was not politically active, was arrested at a government checkpoint. He never returned home. A year into his absence, Heshem, then 14, left Damascus for Istanbul, where he lived for 8 years. 2 of Heshem's sisters also fled Syria, one settling in Germany and the other in Oman. Heshem's mother and younger brother remained behind. When Heshem arrived in Sofia, he went first to Tsar Simeon Street, locally referred to as Arab Street for the many Middle Eastern shops there, to purchase goods for his onward journey. Then the police arrived. They arrested Heshem for illegally entering the country and took him to Busmansi. After a week, an NGO came with a translator and told him he could either request asylum or remain confined for 18 months. As an asylum seeker, he would be released from detention in a week or so. Heshem immediately applied. He needed to reach his older sister in Germany, whom he had not seen in 11 years. In preparation for his release, Heshem was asked to roll his fingers across the glassy surface of a portable biometric machine, which uploads fingerprints from every asylum seeker into an EU database called Eurodac. This allows a government in one country to check whether someone's fingerprints were originally taken in another. The EU-wide system began in 2003 and has been rapidly expanding, part of a renewed effort to track asylum seekers and other migrants through biometrics. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 22nd issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. The authorities dropped Hesham at Vazdebna camp, one of 3 open facilities in Sofia, where asylum seekers receive a bed and meals as their claims are processed. Vazdebna means hostel in Bulgarian. The area surrounding the camp on the city outskirts bears the same name. Guards with guns patrol the inside. Here, as in facilities in Greece, residents have a curfew and cannot have visitors. I'd go to Germany if I were you, an employee told Hesham, who left the next day. Hesham traversed Serbia, the Czech Republic, and Austria, entering Germany a few weeks later. After reaching Saxony-Anhalt, where his sister lives, Hesham went straight to the police and requested asylum. The officers confiscated his phone. He never got it back. Hesham was initially assigned to Halberstadt camp, north of the Harz mountain range, near his sister, who barely recognized the adult version of her brother. At dinner she served plates of kibbeh, stuffed zucchinis, rice with dumplings, food from their childhoods, while her 4-year-old daughter giggled and stared. Hesham threw himself into studying German. A local Amazon warehouse offered to hire him once his papers came through. A possible future took shape, though he dared not hold onto any one vision for too long. The memory of giving his fingerprints to the officials inside Busmancy played on a loop. To quiet the fear of being sent back, he focused on his family. In a photo from those months of waiting, Hesham grins, holding his niece as she makes a peace sign with tiny fingers. Hesham had come to Germany at the wrong time. We are limiting irregular migration to Germany, the chancellor at the time, Olaf Scholz, told the magazine Der Spiegel a few months before Hesham arrived. Too many people are coming, he said, adding, we have to deport people more often and faster. After 4 months in Germany, Hesham received notice that he would be deported to Sofia. The police arrest refugees in the middle of the night so they cannot flee. Hesham spent several months couch surfing with friends, hoping he could wait out the order. In January 2025, the police found him and put him on a commercial flight to Sofia. Once aboard, Hesham protested that he didn't wish to return, and the pilot refused to take off. The authorities released him, and Hesham went back into hiding. 2 weeks later, when he went to renew his ID card at the local immigration office, the police were waiting. They did not let him pack a bag or pick up his belongings. After Hesham was captured, his sister cried for a week. She told her daughter that Hesham had gone on a long trip. Deportations are difficult for the German government to execute. They require an agreement with the receiving country as well as infrastructure, detention facilities, extra police officers, arrangements with commercial airlines or private carriers that the United States has built up over 2 decades. Deportations are humiliating and sometimes violent. Some men are subjected to airport strip and body cavity searches. Deportees are sometimes handcuffed and shackled. Some are restrained with belts. Pilots have at times refused to fly, as happened with Hesham, after realizing refugees are on board against their will, resulting in 342 canceled flights in 2024 alone. When deporting refugees to other EU countries, German courts must consider appeals on several grounds: whether sending someone back would cause serious harm or lead to torture, whether the person has certain family ties in Germany, or serious medical conditions. Refugees are often not deported to Greece because mistreatment there has been well documented. Conditions in Bulgaria are less well known. Almost all of them are sent back, regardless of what happened to them in Bulgaria, says Stephen Reichel, who coordinates church asylum in Germany. In 2024, the German government submitted some 75,000 deportation requests to other EU countries, but little more than half were approved. Only 5,740 individuals were deported within the bloc. Chancellor Friedrich Merz has vowed to close that gap. Germany has poured millions of euros into building detention centers. 4 deportation centers opened this year. One near the Polish border can house 250 people. The day of Heshem's deportation in late February, the police came before the sun rose. The officials that day were respectful. He was not handcuffed. He was given food and water. In the end, there were only 4 other passengers, 3 Syrians and 1 Afghan, all men flying to Sofia on a private plane. The shame colored everything. It was one of the worst days of my life, Hashem told me later. Upon arrival in Sofia, the Bulgarian authorities took Hashem to Busmansi. It would be harder to leave this time. Bulgaria had long served as a transit country for refugees heading north, but it remained shut out of the full rights afforded EU members for failing to control immigration. So it began violently policing its borders. In 2025, after scaling up detention and tightening border security, it was finally admitted to the Schengen area, which allows freedom of movement among member states. To assist its operations, the European Union has, over the past decade, granted the country hundreds of millions of euros for additional immigration control. Under the pact, Bulgaria has also received 90 million euros. The Interior Ministry is creating 2 new detention centers and expanding Busmansi and Ljubimets. At Busmansi, Hashem was informed that his asylum file was closed. Hashem lodged a new claim and after a month was transferred back to the Vrazdebna camp. During his asylum interview, he suspected that his translator was not interpreting correctly, but he had no way to prove it, just a bad feeling. A rejection came 2 months later. It stated that Hashem had migrated for economic reasons. It was true that Hashem wanted desperately to start working, but his main reason for leaving Syria was fear for his safety. After Hashem's father was abducted, his family's house was bombed. Under Bulgarian law, you can appeal an asylum rejection twice. Hashem needed a lawyer to file an appeal within 14 days. At the time, the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee, a non-governmental organization, provided legal aid to asylum seekers. A tall, thin man with glasses told Hashem he would process his paperwork. The committee does not give out private contact details for its lawyers, and all Hashem had was a generic email address. He did not even know the lawyer's name. A few weeks later, some officials came to the camp and asked residents for their IDs. When they saw Hashem's, they took his residency permit away and told him to report to the camp office. Inside, the officials locked the door. Then the police arrived. They arrested Hashem and drove him back to Busmansi. A few days later, Hashem saw his lawyer by chance in a meeting room set aside for legal aid consultations. "Why didn't you file my appeal?" Hashem demanded. The man, Hashem told me, said he forgot. Hashem was in disbelief. "How can you call yourself a lawyer? How could you forget?" Hashem recalled that the man became agitated and began speaking in Bulgarian. Hashem walked out. The Bulgarian Helsinki Committee said it does not comment on individual cases because of attorney-client privilege, and denied that actions on their part led to Hashem's detention. From his cell, Hashem searched for a private lawyer in Sofia. One wanted a minimum of 1,500 euros. He didn't have the money. Hashem had only one friend in Sofia, a fellow Syrian who brought him some clean t-shirts and socks. After his deportation, Hashem appealed his case in Germany, but as time went on, it seemed unlikely a court would allow him to return. Schreiber, the advocate with the Munich Refugee Council, told me that the only person she knew who had been allowed back into Germany was an elderly Syrian woman receiving cancer treatment. Although a German court ruled that deportation illegal, she had to pay for her return flight. One of the hardest things for Hashem about life in Busmanzi was the waiting. He had nothing to fill his days and longed to return to his work as a tailor. As a boy, he spent hours after school in a Damascus factory slicing shapes with an electric blade. Each fabric had a different feel. Hashem loved black velvet, with its density and plushness, the most. In Istanbul, he had designed suits and dresses, sharing the drawings with his sister. Now the future was a blank, dreamless space. He found it impossible to escape the most casual violence that he and the men I spoke with regularly witnessed. One day, a group of guards dragged the Afghan man from solitary confinement and beat him with an iron rod. Another man was punched in the face. Detainees told me that the guards knew where there were missing surveillance cameras, near the laundry room, for instance, and assaulted people there. Last year, a Syrian man in his mid-30s named Ahmad was locked inside Busmanzi, even though he had a valid German residence permit, making it legal for him to travel. Ahmad, who suffers from psychosis, was put in solitary confinement. His sister told me that the guards beat him so brutally after he resisted his deportation that he could not walk for 5 days. The Bulgarian Interior Ministry, which oversees the Migration Directorate that runs Busmanzi and other centers, declined to comment on individual cases, and the Migration Directorate did not respond to a request for comment. Medical care inside Busmanzi is either inadequate or absent. In 2021, an 83-year-old Armenian woman was brought to Busmanzi. She died 5 hours later from heart failure. A review by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture found a pattern of factually inaccurate medical information. All the recorded vitals of detainees were the same. All the medical intake forms said no complaints and language barriers. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 22nd issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. The longer someone stayed inside Busmanzi, the more reality deteriorated. People in the cell have told me I cry in my sleep, Hashem said. Visits are limited to 30 minutes, but many inmates never had a visitor. Some of the people isolated for mental health conditions had not arrived that way. Suicidal ideation is common in immigration detention facilities around the world, increasing in proportion to the length of time detained, but no one wanted to speak on the record for fear it would harm their chances of release. A week after I first visited Busmanzi, I arrived for my appointment with Hashem. I pushed the doorbell at the designated time, hearing a sharp chime on the other side. Some 5 minutes later, the door swung open into a courtyard surrounded by tall metal walls. This time I noticed the UN Refugee Agency registration sign that hung near the entrance. Under the list of rules was, you do not have the right to choose the European country you want to live and receive international protection. I was ushered into a ground floor room that functioned as a visitor center. At last, Hashem appeared, dressed in an oversized purple t-shirt with a few pimples on his cheeks and wispy facial hair. He could have been a sleep-deprived graduate student. A female guard eyed us from the corner. On the wall were Frontex posters. Thinking of returning home, read one, beneath which was a telephone number. Returning home might be difficult, but a counselor can help you, another read. From January to September 2025, Frontex sent its return specialists to conduct 744 meetings with detainees, a spokesman told me. Since Hashem and I first made contact, the guards had yanked him out of his cell 3 times and put him in the room where we were now sitting. Officials pressured him to return to Damascus, once kicking him in the leg, he said. The authorities slid across a document in Bulgarian and told him to sign. He declined. Tacked to a corkboard on the back wall was a Frontex notice on how to file a complaint. I asked if he had more to say about the detention conditions. You've already seen it yourself, Hashem said, gesturing to the room. He pressed his thumb to his lip as if quieting himself. I don't need to say anything more. In the corner, the guard tilted her head and snapped a selfie. Under the European Union's new migration pact, it has become easier for governments to detain asylum seekers, like holding anyone deemed a national security risk or a threat to public order. According to Diana Radoslavova, who founded the Center for Legal Aid, Voice in Bulgaria in 2009, this will only render the situations many refugees already find themselves in more precarious. One of her clients, Abdul Rahman al-Khalidi, a Saudi human rights activist, entered Bulgaria seeking asylum. Though his case is still open, he has been held in Busmansi for more than 4 years, well beyond the legal limit, because Bulgaria's National Security Agency labeled him a threat. The authorities have bounced al-Khalidi between the Refugee Agency and the Interior Ministry section of the facility, threatening to deport him to Saudi Arabia. A Sofia court has ordered him released 3 times. Each time, the Bulgarian government has refused. The Bulgarian ombudsman stated that it would be best if another European country like France or Germany gave al-Khalidi asylum. So far, none has offered. When it comes to people like Hashem, the biggest question is the misuse of detention, Radoslavova said. The use of detention in the absence of active removal proceedings violates EU law, and under Bulgarian law, rejected asylum seekers can only be detained for the purpose of deportation for 18 months. But Bulgaria cannot force Syrians to return to their home countries because it has no agreement with the government of President Ahmed al-Sharaa. If you know that this person cannot be forcibly returned, she said, why do you detain them for 18 months? Once people with rejected asylum claims are released from Busmansi, they have no access to health care, subsidized housing, or social services. Over the past year, Radoslavova has been contacted frequently by German advocates dismayed to find that clients deported to Bulgaria are destitute. Families have difficulty enrolling their children in school or finding a place to live. When I asked the German Interior Ministry if it had considered halting deportations to Bulgaria because of conditions there, a spokeswoman referred me to the Bulgarian government. Daniel Mitov, Bulgaria's interior minister, defended the lack of alternatives to detention. He told me that if asylum seekers were free, they would head north, and then other European countries would call and say, well, you have allowed these individuals to cross illegally through your territory. Now we're going to get them back to you, and it's your problem. Mitov pointed out that the border between Bulgaria and Turkey was the second busiest in the world after the U.S.-Mexico border. The European Union has sent hundreds of Frontex police officers to assist local forces and piloted a new surveillance system with drones. Even the Americans, Mitov said, were helping the Bulgarian border police. The Interior Ministry coordinated its efforts with the U.S. Embassy and Washington. Bulgaria shares the biometrics of people who enter the country illegally with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. The biometrics are run through databases at the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and Department of Defense. The State Department spokesman in Sofia confirmed that the United States shares equipment, training, and advice with Bulgaria, calling it a close and effective relationship on border operations. As for the conditions inside Bosmansi, Mitov blamed the refugees. Quite often the people who stay there do not appreciate the environment, he remarked dryly. You're asking that people staying inside damage the facility? I asked. Yes, he said. The human traffickers are giving them advice to treat the facilities in ways that afterward they can complain. Across the European Union, Ukrainians have been received very differently from Syrians, Afghans, and others. In 2022, as Ukrainians fled Russian bombs, the Bulgarian government rented empty hotels along the Black Sea to house them. The bloc contributed money for private housing and language classes. Kirill Petkov, then the prime minister, explained the government's logic. These people are Europeans, he told journalists. These people are intelligent. They are educated people, he added. This is not the refugee wave we have been used to. People we were not sure about their identity, people with unclear pasts who could even have been terrorists. As the Migration Pact comes into full force this summer, countries will have even more flexibility in how they treat those seeking asylum. One provision relies on what is known as the legal fiction of non-entry. States can claim someone is not on European territory despite having crossed the border, creating liminal spaces where they can argue that EU law does not apply. Those interviewed and rejected for asylum in those borderlands are no longer guaranteed legal representation. In late October, Bosmansi guards notified Hesham and some 80 other detainees, mostly Syrian and Moroccan men, that they would be moved to the Lyubimets detention center, just 18 miles from the Turkish border. They did not tell them why. Hesham packed his few belongings and traveled 3 hours south by bus. A few days later, a delegation from the European Commission toured an almost empty Bosmansi to see if it met EU standards. Abdul Rahman, who later requested to be transferred to Lyubimets, spoke with members of the mission as Bulgarian officials hovered nearby. In Lyubimets, a vast facility that includes accommodation in metal shipping containers, the food was still inedible, but the room that Hesham shared with 20 men was cleaner. Hesham and the others were more isolated, though, because it was harder to receive visitors from Sofia. After 2 weeks, officials called Hesham into a room and told him they were offering 150 euros for him to return to Syria, promising another 700 euros upon arrival. Hesham refused. Every week when his mother called, she begged him to come home, but he didn't think Syria was a country he could live in yet. After the fall of the Assad regime, some prisoners were released, but there was no information about Hesham's father, one of many men who were still missing. On January 1st, Hesham turned 27. As one day of confinement followed another, Hesham brought back to advise his father had thought back to advice his father had given him, encouraging him to study. He was a feisty kid, not as interested in school as his sisters, who pursued degrees in law and chemistry. Hesham was sorry that he hadn't yet lived up to his father's vision. Maybe there was still time. If he could make it 11 more months, he would be free by his next birthday. But what that freedom would look like remained uncertain. A correction was made on February 18, 2026. An early version of this article referred imprecisely to the work of the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee, a non-governmental organization. The legal aid that they provided to asylum seekers was not undertaken as part of a contract with the Bulgarian government. Additionally, while the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee denies that it was responsible for the outcome in Heshem's case, it does not deny involvement in the case altogether. All it is pain. The Olympian testing the limits of endurance by Reed Forgrave. The deepest Jessie Diggins ever descended into the pain cave was on February 20th, 2022, the final day of the Beijing Winter Olympics, when she raced in the women's 30-kilometer freestyle cross-country skiing event. The conditions at the National Cross-Country Skiing Center in Zhengzhou were brutal. The trails in northern China were nestled in the valleys of a dry mountainous landscape. Siberian winds whipped in from the Lake Baikal Basin and the Mongolian steppe, blowing snow across the course. The day before, the -21 wind chill and the 30-mile-an-hour gusts forced Olympic organizers to cut the men's 50-kilometer race nearly in half. But the conditions for Diggins, who had covered her nose, cheeks, and earlobes with kinesiology tape to protect against frostbite, were even worse than they were for her 62 competitors. About 30 hours before the start, she became violently ill from what she believes was food poisoning. She couldn't keep down food or liquid. The morning before the race, she couldn't complete a 10-minute jog and instead climbed back into bed and cried. She called her parents. This isn't how it's supposed to be. There were expectations now. 4 years earlier, Diggins and her teammate, Kakan Randall, had put the cross-country world on notice by winning an Olympic gold medal, America's first ever in cross-country, in the freestyle team sprint event. And Diggins, who is now 34 and the best cross-country skier in American history, in a sport that might feature mankind's fittest competitors, had shown that while her skiing technique may lack the traditional excellence of the world's top skiers, no one was better at enduring the pain her sport demands. Competitors who hoped to win a medal knew they would have to battle Diggins for it. Her body slowly came back to life that evening. She ate bananas and peanut butter and oatmeal. She sipped electrolyte heavy sports drinks. She rode a spin bike, and the next morning she decided she had to race. Do this, Diggins recalls her mother's writing. You don't owe anyone anything. If you go out there and decide to start, do it with a full heart because you love what you do. Her mom's email had a calming effect. Racing that day wasn't about fulfilling outside expectations. It was only about trying to satisfy her own. In my head, I'm like, pressure's off, Diggins says she thought at the starting line. The fact I'm standing here is an absolute miracle. Less than half a kilometer into the race, which consisted of 4 loops around a 7.5-kilometer course, another skier cut her off and she crashed. A bad start, but she managed to push herself toward the front. Feeling no obligation to finish, she felt freed. Diggins closely tracked the leader, the Norwegian star Therese Johaug, but at a feed zone less than halfway through the race, where coaches handed out fluids and high-calorie gels to the racers, Diggins made a mistake. As Johaug sped through the feed zone, Diggins turned away while grabbing a high-carbohydrate drink. By the time Diggins looked up, Johaug was out of reach. This was a problem. On such a windy day, drafting behind another skier could make a huge difference. The slipstream created by closely following another skier would allow Diggins to conserve energy while maintaining speed. Do not ski alone, Diggins' coaches shouted at her. But there she was, exposed by herself in second place, 48 seconds ahead of the next skier. Around that time, Diggins felt a twinge on the inside of her knees, the first sign of cramping. Slowly, the rest of her body cramped, legs, hips. As she passed her coaches, she was so disoriented, she had to ask one of them what lap she was on. That's not a good sign, Diggins says. By the 4th and final lap, coaches from the U.S. and other national teams cheered encouragement. They could see that Diggins' body was failing. Her vision turned pink. Sound was muffled. Sports scientists describe this as a body in crisis. It's all overwhelmingly trying to stop her from moving forward any longer, says Ru Lee, an associate clinical professor of exercise science at Northeastern University in Boston. Her muscles were depleted. Most likely she was experiencing dehydration and possibly hypoglycemia. My best rates, there's no noise, says Liz Stephen, a former Olympic skier and mentor to Diggins. A lot of people lose sound. They lose their sensory experience, taste, smell, sound. Those things go away. Even vision is just what you're focused on. Kick and glide. My world becomes very bubbled. When Diggins crossed the finish line in 1 hour 26 minutes 37.3 seconds, nearly a minute ahead of the bronze medalist, which made her the first non-European to medal in that event, she collapsed, skis split akimbo, face in the snow, a marionette whose strings had been cut. Her eyes were open, contacts frozen to her eyeballs, but she couldn't see. Her breathing was a shallow panting. At first she didn't know where the sound was coming from. Then I realized, oh my God, that's me, she says. When she tried to stand, she collapsed again. 2 minutes after she had finished her race, she was carried to a warming hut and gently laid next to a space heater. She now says she probably should have been taken to the hospital. Instead, she managed to climb the podium to receive her silver medal. But she was not well. I was falling apart, in bed 15 hours a day, Diggins says. I finally went home and rested for 2 weeks to feel like myself in my body. You only have so many of these races in the tank. That was 4 years ago at her last Olympic race. Now as she heads into this month's Winter Games in Italy, Diggins thinks back to that race as a moment that made her question how far is too far. I'm glad I know I can dig that deep, she says, but I should not. Sports scientists agree that few sports test the human body more than cross-country skiing. A research paper from 2017 on the physiological capacity of the best cross-country skiers, one of whose authors is the sports director at the Norwegian School of Elite Sports, is subtitled, Approaching the Upper Limits of Human Endurance. Clay Diggins, Jesse's father, has another way of putting it. If you had the 100 most fit people on the planet in one room, Jesse would be in that room. There are two principal reasons for the superior conditioning of cross-country skiers, according to Laura Richardson, a clinical exercise physiologist at the University of Michigan School of Kinesiology. First, theirs is a quadrupedal sport, with arms and legs working hard at the same time, along with core and back muscles. Because the body's cardiovascular system is not accustomed to serving those large muscle groups simultaneously at high rates of exertion, they all compete for the available blood. Over time, the body adapts by increasing blood volume, so the heart pumps more blood with each heartbeat. This sends more hemoglobin with oxygen throughout the body. As a result, most elite cross-country skiers like Diggins have an especially powerful heart muscle and an especially large and strong left ventricle to pump out more blood per minute. The mitochondria in muscle tissues, the powerhouses of the cell, in turn, grow in size and in numbers to handle the rise in oxygen. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 22nd issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. All these changes improve aerobic capacity as measured by the maximum volume of oxygen, or VO2 max, that the body can use during intense exercise. A higher VO2 max means a greater capacity to use oxygen to produce energy, which enhances endurance. There are other quadrupedal endurance sports like swimming and rowing, but swimmers and rowers don't have to race up and down hills, and because swimmers are buoyed in water and rowers sit upright, in neither sport does body weight have the same impact as it does in skiing. A skier's body also has to work harder in the cold. The second reason for the superior conditioning of elite cross-country skiers is that their sport, by its nature, is interval training. High-intensity bursts of activity are interspersed with lesser-intensity recovery periods. This increases aerobic capacity. Going up hills typically takes up a third of the average course's length, but half of a skier's time on the course. That's where the body works the hardest. During a race, cross-country skiers have to be able to perform steadily at a near peak of aerobic exertion throughout the entire course, while also surging to peak anaerobic power on the hills. That's their challenge. Their body has to constantly have the energy to shift between the relative contribution of these energy pathways, Ru Lee says. It demands remarkable stamina and endurance. Then, on the other hand, you have to be able to handle the repeated supermaximal muscle power output on the climbs. You have to excel at both aerobic and anaerobic extremes. In addition to requiring a strong physiological engine, cross-country skiing demands technical mastery. The sport has two main disciplines: classic, which includes diagonal striding in parallel groomed tracks that's similar to running, and skate, a faster, more dynamic movement in which skiers bob in a U-shaped motion similar to that in ice skating. In skate skiing, the main techniques are V1 technique, a low gear for uphill on which the skier plants one ski and both poles simultaneously, then follows with a single leg push-off, and the elegant but complicated V2 technique, used on flatter terrain, which incorporates double pole pushes while the body shifts from balancing on one gliding ski to the other. Diggins, who has finished first or second overall the past 5 World Cup seasons, is strongest in skate skiing, but last season, after more than 300 World Cup events, she finally won a classic race. While Diggins lacks the brute strength of some of her Olympic peers and does not always make the best tactical choices, her ability to tolerate pain is her greatest asset. She's one of the best at getting exhausted and one of the best at continuing after she's exhausted, says Thomas Losnegard, a skiing professor at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences and head of the Department of Endurance at the Norwegian Olympic Training Center. We think it's fascinating that someone from the U.S. could actually beat a Norwegian. Sports science can tell you a lot. You can measure heart rates, VO2 max, and lactate levels, which at high levels indicate a lack of oxygen, but it can't tell you much about the root of Diggins' stature in the sport, because, says Øyvind Sandbakk, the sports director at the Norwegian School of Elite Sports, you cannot measure mental capacity. Diggins discovered this superpower at 15 when, as a freshman, she was anchoring the final leg of a high school relay. Her teammates told her that she had to beat a particular skier from a rival high school who would be wearing a green race suit, but the rival team had more than 100 skiers, with multiple relay teams in each race, and Diggins was overwhelmed at seeing some 20 skiers wearing the same green race suit. She couldn't figure out who she needed to pass, or even which green suits were on the third leg and which were on the final leg. Pushing herself in a way she had never done before, she passed all 20 skiers from the rival team, then collapsed at the finish, thinking she was going to die. Then 30 seconds later it was, "Oh, I'm not going to die," Diggins recalls. It was a huge light bulb. This whole next level had been there the whole time, and I can access it if I'm willing to push that hard. All it is pain. It's not permanent damage. I want to know what my true potential is. I never want to wonder. What if I had just been a little tougher mentally? But Diggins' greatest strength can be her greatest weakness. The mental toughness that allows her to go deep into her pain cave also pushed her toward her darkest moments. Jessie's gift and her Achilles heel is that her body is able to withstand so much, says Julia Kern, her teammate and close friend. Jessie's ability to recover is so quick that her mind doesn't give her a sign to stop. Growing up outside St. Paul, Minnesota, her mentality was all gas, no brakes. She was a fiercely independent child. "Now let me do it," she would tell her parents. Diggins was a 4.0 student, a competitive swimmer, a virtuoso violinist. Her parents had to force her to rest. In her bedroom, her only cross-country skiing poster was of a man skiing on a sandy beach, and she aspired to be that man. Bill Cook, the first American to win an Olympic medal in cross-country skiing in 1976, and the only one until Diggins and Randall won gold in 2018. There's people who are like, a little bit is good, but a lot is probably better, and there's a degree of that in her, says Jason Cork, her longtime coach. She's someone who doesn't go halfway, Diggins acknowledges as much, saying of cross country, "This is the healthiest sport in the whole world, except at the very top of the sport. The way we do it is maybe not that good for us." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 22nd issue of the New York Times Magazine. Your reader has been Evelyn. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today at 2 o'clock with episode number 47 of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. Stay with us for these readings and more. You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We broadcast daily readings of printed matter to those who are blind or have a print disability throughout Buffalo, Western New York.
Hello. The following program is intended for